want to speak for a few minutes? I mean, in terms of your reactions to the film, have you seen it before, or?
This was the first time I actually saw the film, and I've heard a little bit about it, and seeing the clip. I mean, I think one of the things that really resonated with me as I started thinking a little bit more is the context of Arizona versus the context of New York. And, you know, the real, obviously, criminalization that's happening in Arizona and so forth. And kind of thinking about New York, and, well, it's not to say that these similar things don't happen, but in a sense, New York is a much more friendlier immigration place than Arizona certainly is. In terms of elected officials, we don't have the demonization as much that happens here in New York, which I think makes it a much more open climate. It's not to say that immigrants don't have some of the same issues that the film portrayed and so forth, but in a sense, and don't have some of the same fears, but I think in terms of the political climate, it's a much different context. So I think that to me was one of the, you know, the glaring things that I can kind of take away from it.
I also picked up that discrepancy as well. I mean, between the experiences in Arizona and the experiences in New York City. My focus for the last several years has been covering immigrant communities in New York City, and it sometimes feels quite anomalous when you look at the rest of the country. A succession of a series of mayoral administrations have reaffirmed the status of New York City as a so-called sanctuary city. The other reaction I had to this was realizing just how much personalities can drive politics. And it's something that I've known about, and it's constantly reaffirmed. But in this case, it's perfectly apparent. This is a guy who has a deep conviction about how to run his office and how to enforce the law.
I did a story, you know, before 9/11 changed everything, of course, but, you know, I did a story in 2001 where I followed a Mexican teenager up to the Bronx, and I spent a year, you know, going through that process. And at that point, immigration for me was largely an urban thing, where people were coming to the cities. He was coming to the Bronx, and all his friends and family were coming to the Bronx or Brooklyn. But now he's now in Tennessee, and his brother's in Kentucky, and he's got cousins in Iowa. And so immigration has really changed. It's not just an urban thing. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that and how that's changing the debate in America.
Yeah. Well, I think New York, LA, Chicago have been gateway cities for immigration for a very long time. And now we see immigration, and not just of Mexicans, but many other groups, you know, going to rural areas, going to, you know, other cities that aren't the gateway cities. And I think it really is changing, and I think it's, as all change does, creates certain tumulsion, because with new change and demographic change, there's certain conflicts that are happening, but also the positives too, the infusion of different cultures and languages and so forth. But it's, there's, in terms of the Mexican population, the South is exploding. Georgia, Kentucky, and so forth have, you know, from the last census, have exploded 400% in Georgia, I think it is, or something. So it's a reality, you know. They're going to places that haven't been traditional destinations prior to that.
I don't think this was a perfect film, and I thought, had I made this film, let me start that again. As a viewer of the film, I'm somewhat critical that they didn't spend more time investigating the reasons for Arpaio's support. There were snippets here and there, quotes, scenes that showed him being adored, but I'm kind of fascinated by that, totally fascinated. And you could sit down, find some reasonable people who just happen to have a different point of view than than you might have, or that the filmmakers apparently have, and just get them to explain. You know?
Did you feel that there was, I mean, they talked about the whole thing where they were cutting off the heads, and then it turned out that this wasn't actually going on in Arizona. I mean, do you feel that there's a lot of fear-mongering going on? Do you, in terms of appealing to people's, just fears or worse prejudices, et cetera, or?
I do, sure.
Yeah, I think Gail Brewer, who did the whole beheading thing, and the media played into a lot of what she was saying and so forth, and I think Arizona as a border state also has a different culture and interface with immigration as well. So, I mean, I not knowing exactly and not living there, I mean, I think people who live at the border, maybe that's where a lot of the wide support is, because maybe, I mean, from their perspective, it is, chaos and what's happening, and we don't know. I mean, the film didn't really, go into any of that either. But you read certain things, and so. But I think, some of those sensationalisms get played out in the media, and I think they do get a little bit of fire to them at times.
Right. The other question, can you just sort of succinctly explain, like, what is somebody who's been here for years, who's undocumented, what are they actually up against? And if there is no immigration reform, how are their lives circumscribed? I think, I'm not sure everybody in the room understands sort of how people's lives are really what's the word I'm looking for? Well, affected. That's a good word.
Someone who's undocumented, I mean, everybody has a different story, so I can't speak for everybody who is undocumented, but certainly if you're undocumented, there's a lot of uncertainty in your life in terms of sometimes disclosing your status, from securing jobs, in terms of schooling, living under the radar, and just sort of living in the shadows, so to speak, that phrase for what it is. And it's real, whether you're in a more sympathetic city or not, it's still a hardship, because if you don't want to disclose the reality of the situation, it makes you feel timid, and not feeling to be able to express yourself.
You can't work legally.
Can't, it's...
That's a big thing. And also, I mean, the pass-along effects, there are pass-along effects to the broader community surround you, your family, starting with your family, your children, particularly U.S.-born children.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been studies done recently on the impact of growing up as a native-born child of an undocumented immigrant parent, and how, because of that fear, that sort of the fear, the cloud of fear under which you live, being undocumented and trying to stay beneath the radar, it discourages you from actually seeking public assistance services for your U.S.-born children that the children are entitled to, being U.S. citizens.